Hello, everyone. Welcome to lecture number 2 on the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. Please take the time at the beginning of each lecture to write down the lecture terms and listen for those and write down their definitions as I cover them within each particular lecture for that unit. Why am I pointing this out? I just want to make sure that you folks understand how critically important it is when you're sitting down to study for the unit examinations for you to understand the lecture terms and have them memorized, because you will see questions on each unit exam that come directly from the lecture terms that can be found on the second slide of every PowerPoint slide set. So with that bit of business taken care of, let's move on to the lecture material. Have you ever wondered why there are so many different varieties of Christianity? Maybe it's crossed your mind, maybe not. But we have Baptists, for example. We have Lutherans. We have Presbyterians. It's a lot of different variety, shall we say, within Western Christianity. It didn't used to be that way, however. In fact, Western Christianity used to be united under one church, the Roman Catholic Church. But here's where the Protestant Reformation comes in, and we'll see a big split in Western Christianity away from the Roman Catholic Church's complete domination of Western Christianity prior to this point. Let's take a look at the influence of the Northern Renaissance. When many people think about the Renaissance, they envision the great sculptures of Michelangelo or the elaborate paintings of artists from that time period, such as Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa with her famous smile. But that's not all there was to the Renaissance. And in fact, in many northern regions of Europe, think England or France or the Netherlands, we're going to see, yes, some amazing art coming from this time period, but we're also going to see a newer generation of religious scholars. Those people who were well versed in Christian theology, they knew the scriptures inside and out, and some of these highly trained scholars are going to begin to take a much more critical look at the Roman Catholic Church. One of these newer generations of Renaissance humanist scholars was known by the name of Erasmus. And one of Erasmus's most famous works will be his 1509 publication of the satire In Praise of Folly. So we need to take a moment to understand why Erasmus is going to mockingly write about the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church. Some of that likely had to do with the fact that he was born as the illegitimate son of a clergyman. During this period, service in the Roman Catholic Church required complete celibacy. You could not marry, you were not expected to have sexual relationships with anyone. And so you could say that quite literally Erasmus was sort of born to be someone who was sensitive to the hypocrisy of some members of the Roman Catholic clergy. As he grew into adulthood, he will himself join the Roman Catholic clergy, and at that point he'll be exposed to even more unsavory conduct among some members of the church. Take a look, for example, at the quotation that I have here on the slide. Monasteries with no discipline, he said, worse than brothels or houses of prostitution. There are others where religion is nothing but ritual. He's just going to kind of go on and on about the lack of discipline, moral discipline among these members of the clergy that are supposed to be upstanding members of their communities. But why is he disguising his substantive criticisms of the Roman Catholic Church in humor? His work in Praise of Folly is not meant to be a direct attack, but sort of an indirect attack on the Roman Catholic Church. Well, we need to understand how very powerful the Roman Catholic Church was during this period by way of explanation. By 1500, the Roman Catholic Church was a formidable entity in Western Europe. Their power came from many different sources: political power as advisors to kings, cultural power, economic influence. And we're going to see that in some instances, the church will, certain members of the church, I should say, will begin to abuse some of the power that they wielded. The church, for example, often weighed in on the political matters of happenings on the continent. And in fact, not only were they sort of welcome or sometimes unwelcome advisors to kings, but they also exercised control through a tremendous amount of territory that was at least nominally loyal to the church, known as the Holy Roman Empire. You can see the vast extent of the Holy Roman Empire during this period by taking a look at the map. The Roman Catholic Church also wielded a tremendous amount of cultural power. The common belief during this period is the only way that you get to heaven is by doing exactly what the Roman Catholic Church's representatives tell you what to do. Most people at this period are still illiterate, and they rely 100% on what the church says they need to do to get to the pearly gates. The church also enjoyed tremendous economic power. It possessed enormous amounts of wealth by this period, enriched by donations from its congregations. When people would pass away, in some instances, they would donate their family lands to the church. The church was the largest landholder in all of Western Europe by 1500, and they rented out quite a bit of that territory to farmers and artisans and what have you, and so that they were getting rents from those lands each year, which further enriched their coffers. For instance, about 1/3 of all land on the continent by 1050 was owned directly by the Roman Catholic Church. And even today, the church still maintains a vast portfolio of real estate, more land owned by them globally than any other organization on the planet. But in addition to these sources of income, we're going to see the church beginning to sell what became known as indulgences. The church was able to raise revenue when priests and officials sold these indulgences, which in an informal sense were, I'll describe them as a get out of hell free card, limiting a person's time in purgatory. It was a way in which people thought that they were buying a faster ticket to heaven, in other words. Now, indulgences were historically supposed to be based upon the good works of people who came before you, a treasury of grace that you might tap into. However, when medieval popes such as Julius II and Leo X became strapped for cash, they instead began simply selling indulgences to the wealthy on the open market. This came under fire. Humanist scholars of the Renaissance began to ask, well, what about living a simple, good, godly life? Does this mean that you can just sin all you want and then pay your way out of punishment in the afterlife by throwing some coins at the Roman Catholic Church and purchasing indulgences? Well, on this last issue in particular, with the sale of indulgences, one man began to speak out forcefully against the abuses of the church. That man became the leader of what will become known as the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. Luther had an humble upbringing, but his parents managed to scrape up enough money for him to attend the University of Erfurt to study law. And while he originally entered school to study theology and law, after a while it was theology that kept bringing him back. After a near-death experience, Luther became consumed with the idea of salvation. He was convinced that he was a lost soul and that none of his good works or his entrance into the Augustine monastery seemed to free him from the gnawing feeling that he was destined for hell. This question of, am I good enough to go to heaven? Have I done enough good works to go to heaven, as the church has said, began to consume him. He began poring over the scriptures, seeking any reassurance that he could get that he might, in fact, be saved from damnation. Ultimately, as he was flipping through the scriptures, he landed on Romans 1:17, which said, "For the justice of God is revealed from faith to faith, in that it is written, for the just shall live by faith." This concept is what Luther turned into the notion of sola fide, which is salvation by faith alone. This is different than what the Roman Catholic Church had been saying about salvation. The church advocated the idea that it was your good works that got you into heaven. Luther begins to argue that instead you are saved just simply by having faith. This concept of salvation by faith alone, though, really was radical, because if this more people began to believe it, it meant that the power of the Roman Catholic Church would be diminished. No longer would people feel like they had to listen to what the church had to say just to get to heaven. Now, if they embrace this notion of sola fide, just believing was enough. But Luther's criticisms of the church went even deeper. To his mind, he felt that the corrupt practices, such as the sale of indulgences by the Roman Catholic Church, served to weaken one's faith instead of strengthening it. He argued that now you could sin all you wanted, but pay the priest off and you would not suffer in purgatory. Luther began to put his thoughts on paper, and in 1517, on the eve of All Saints' Day, Martin Luther nailed a copy of his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg. These theses, or statements, were a list of criticisms of the Roman Catholic Church related to abuses such as the sale of indulgences. Luther also said the Bible was the sole authority in religious matters, not the Pope and not the church governing bodies. He also argued that the church hierarchy should be abolished. All of these things are a significant challenge to the enormous power that the Catholic Church had experienced up until this point. And as a result, the fallout is going to be an immediate controversy. Passages such as the following that you see here on the slide, calling out the Pope for, selling these indulgences, who he said are to the poor folk who are being fleeced, he said, this causes a huge ripple within the church. No one prior to this point has dared to openly challenge the supreme authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And folks wanted to read about what was going on. Word of these 95 Theses began to spread very quickly, and before long, a student copied Luther's Latin text and translated it into German so more people living in that region could actually read it for themselves, and he even sent it off to a university press for publication. And here's where we need to say an important word about technology. It was the printing press that allowed Luther's message to spread so rapidly, along with the translations of the Bible from Latin into local languages, such as German or French or English. Now, a much larger population than ever before in the history of the continent could cheaply purchase a copy of the scriptures, or they could find a copy of Luther's writings in their own language. Now, let me be clear. Luther and his followers did not originally intend to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. They instead wanted to reform the church. That's why it's known as the Protestant Reformation. However, because the Roman Catholic Church will not be willing to reform itself, ultimately Luther and the many groups that will end up following him will have to break away from the church. Luther was dragged before church officials in order to recant his 95 Theses. Luther refused, however, and was charged with disobeying the Pope and the church councils, and he was simply excommunicated or thrown out of the Roman Catholic Church in 1520 by Pope Leo X. He refused to back down, however, and soon enough we'll see other critics beginning to arise of the Roman Catholic Church. John Calvin, for instance, a lawyer by trade, also became deeply interested in theological matters over time and wanted Christians to completely remake not only the church but also society. What Calvin will do is set up basically a church-led state, a theocracy in Geneva, Switzerland over time, where he wants to use his influence to basically reshape the lives of everyone, the spiritual lives. He's going to draft new laws for the city. Ultimately, he's going to create a new way of life, not just of worship, for the residents of the city of Geneva. In fact, he becomes known as the Pope of Geneva for this reason. Monasteries were dissolved. Catholic Mass was abolished. Existing church services were stripped down to the bare bones. You had to attend services every day of the week. Musical instruments were even banned from churches. This is not going to be a very happy place as far as song and dance, but for John Calvin, your faith should be a matter of utmost seriousness. And we'll pick up with John Calvin in part 2 of this lecture.